Ah, we seem to be live. This is conversation community shared understanding. Now, this is part of a both long series of sends previously through conversation community, and also a bit of an experimental piece with the intention of trying to bridge a couple of ongoing conversations and threads and interactions between me and some other conversation community members. Now, the idea is actually rather simple. This, you could basically see the digital discourse in these proprietary digital platforms, Facebook, Google+, two of the most common, as kind of a massively multiplayer game where you get to participate, but there's only 3 valid moves, namely cat gifs, cats and dogs, basically, selfies, and content marketing. Now, there's a possibly kind of a redeeming quality to this. I mean, from a pure reason lens, this is just rubbish, right? And a huge waste of time. Recent stats indicates that there's an average American spends around 40 minutes every day on Facebook. So it's basically kind of the equivalent of a temp job. And no one of these people, I mean, very few of them actually are paid or remunerated anything for it. Now, there's a co-creation of value going on. So, very crudely, you could say that these 3 levels, cat gives, selfies, and content marketing, sort of correspond to the 3 very core human needs. So let's say there's 3 different ways of operating our minds, simplifying a bit here. First, we have sort of an opaque mind, kind of a mind that thrives inside very definite boundaries. Right? It's me, and that's sort of not me. The way you can sort of typically see how such a mind operates inside a digital network is that they're basically not participating as themselves. They're participating via proxy, via cat gifts, cats and dogs, or some other objects that are sort of deemed safe. Food, sports, something very, very tangible. Or kind of a more reserved, lurking, introvert way. So instead of cats and dogs, there's nature sceneries, pithy quotes, and pretty pictures. It's kind of the yin equivalent to the cats and dogs yang. So the dynamic here is denial. So that there's a denial going on anything that is sort of not analog, not me, not my mind, not my opaque, sharply defined mind. Because this whole digital realm is very new, and there's uncertainty and fear and reservation and confusion and whatnot. And actually, confusion is sort of when we enter the next stage, where we do selfies. So selfies is also a good thing, really. Obviously, from a purely reasonable point of view, it's a huge waste of time and it's kind of vanity to boot. But underneath, there's a confusion going on, corresponding to how we are beginning to figure out who are we as digital avatars. And it's kind of still anyone's guess what even that is, right? But we extend ourselves, part of ourselves, we prettify ourselves, we put on makeup and host a Hangout show, or we post lots and lots of pictures with update on how we look like. Selfies to the nth variation. So this is basically the main engine of social media, where we actually claim, occupy, emulate, embrace social media in all its various forms. So this confusion, when transformed, is then social learning. So this is kind of the huge prize, gift, if you will, out of all this confusion. Everyone basically sort of posting pictures about themselves. The type of mind that this sort of corresponds with is the absorbent mind. And Maria Montessori has sort of written tons of this. I won't sort of recapitulate that here. So on the first level, cats and dogs, or pretty pithy quotes and pretty pictures, that's kind of the opaque mind. A mind sort of is not yet ready, willing, or able to project, extend itself into a digital realm. Stage number 2 is where denial is replaced by confusion. So absorbent mind, social media confusion, and everyone basically just completely self-absorbed to begin with, and then gradually it's replaced by more or less of a social learning corresponding with figuring out who we are as digital selves, and whatever connections that we glean out of rediscovering how we are connected in between an analog, real embodied selves, our real selves, and our digital selves. And then there's the third level, which is kind of a beginning transceiving mind, as if there's actually a possibility for us to communicate anything and building shared understanding with others. Now, again, since this digital realm is very new, we have sort of a very heavily ritualized version of this transceiving mind. So 99% of all the transceiving going on, all the social cognition, if you will, is basically content marketing. So it's very transactional, it's very Western still, it's very yang, it's very male, power narratives, but it's still the first stumbling steps on of you could say movement. So this is social cognition beginning to grow legs, where we begin to become able to message each other in a way that actually results in relations, connectivity, transactions, sense making, world making. I mean, you could say that digital brands is kind of the first crude steps in building something that is actually existing in the digital realm, beyond our replicating it. I mean, bearing in mind that there's 3 levels of mind here, the opaque mind actually doesn't exist inside this digital realm, but rather is looking through it through sort of a keyhole. The absorbent mind is beginning to enact a digital realm, but is almost completely unsure how to do that. And content marketing offers kind of rope paths through the digital realm. So there's at least something to go by. So there's a way to sort of how to do Facebook or how to win in Google+, basically endless variations of how to sort of be friendly, win friends, and influence people, kind of recapitulating all metaphors there again. There's possibly a 4th level, which we really don't know yet. I mean, we could call that sensuous, collective intelligence, collaborative sense-making, shared mindfulness. But the new thing here is that, and the reason for why we're still stumbling a bit on this eventual possible 4th level is that this would be social cognition in a collective sense, in a collaborative sense. Now, this would mean we would have to unlearn our fear and denial from sort of our opaque mind, but we will still need the boundaries that that level of mind provides, knowing who I am and who I'm not, right? In terms of individuality, identity, cultural belonging, and whatnot, language. I mean, I'm Swedish right now, I'm talking English right now, so I sort of need to know what's what. We would also sort of need to keep certain parts of sort of the confusion, because otherwise we will sort of grow almost sort of completely ritualized and stuck there in the third level in terms of the content marketing. If we just pick the first package deal solution to how we are doing social cognition, the chances are, which we can see sort of tons of examples of, we will basically get stuck in the first ever metaphors that seems to fit the occasion. Marketing, power narratives, male narratives, success to the successful, who gets to be the loudest is the most influential, and so on. I've tried to sort of stay away from most of the sort of difficult words, but let me just put one in. What sort of runs through like a golden thread through all these levels is something that I more and more am convinced you could sort of say is enaction. So enaction, given that we are kind of sort of thrown into this digital realm, and we still sort of need to be more or less ourselves in an analog embodied capacity, I basically distilled to just one sentence that these digital spaces then turn sort of play spaces in an enactive context. So the sentence is like this: we love to figure some things out and move forward. So instead of sort of me bothering with sort of giving you the full spiel of an action and an activity and intersubjectivity and God knows what I would add, I'm choosing to sort of distill just that one sentence. And it's kind of a very deliberate wordplay. Instead of saying we love to figure some things out and move forward, that's kind of not as interesting as if we love to figure some things out and move forward. So we kind of using, this is again kind of reinforcing the enactivity, because we're using our own individual cognition, or we are borrowing from old metaphors, old narratives, old sort of collective definitions, which is also cognition indirectly via proxy. I mean, I'm using the English language as a proxy for making myself understood here, hopefully. But what if we can use that to figure out how to use social cognition itself? Now, this is metacognition, obviously, but instead of sort of going full deep on the metacognition aspect, which I will probably do in a later send, I basically changed things to thinks with a K. We love to figure some things out and move forward. Now, the movement here is obviously to begin with a movement to sort of just keyhole peeking in terms of the Opaque mind, sort of flinging out some cats and dogs, petticoats and pretty pictures, see what happens, right? And basically signaling just that I'm harmless, mostly because cats and dogs. The absorbent mind is the sort of strange tug, fascination, creative tension of sort of trying to both discern and filter out lots of the noise, but still remaining very curious, because you might find something serendipitously that will help inform whatever your social learning needs are, whatever the reason for why then an American is spending on average 40 minutes on Facebook. We could sort of guess, or we could hope that those 40 minutes aren't just sort of pure escapism. There might be sort of deeper reasons for it. And once there's some kind of social learning going on, there's also at least the possibility of some kind of social cognition building on this social learning. And on top of this, once we have some kind of social identity, and this means including the old traditional identity, I mean us in physical bodies, and a beginning understanding of sort of at least put a profile up in a sort of digital space. So there's a social identity, there's a social learning, and there's a social cognition. Those would then possibly, we could possibly begin to put these together into some kind of synthesis. And that synthesis will then be a floor, foundation for shared understanding. Now, the reason for why this might be important is that I can give you just one example. There's thousands of examples why it could be important. We are sort of slowly gravitating from television, mass media, broadcast, basically just one way, social media, if you will, digital media, towards a slightly more beginning two-way, slightly more of a dialogue than just broadcast. And on Google Plus alone, there's 360 million active accounts. Let's say there's just 1% of them who are really active. I mean, putting in their own ideas, identities, and so on. But there's still 4 million people. Now, if these 4 million people would begin to co-create a digital discourse, we could basically kickstart and reboot and reclaim whatnot. I mean, the whole planetary civilization, if we would want to. Right? So that's just one example of why it would possibly be really, really important. But there's many others. I mean, intercultural understanding, shared understanding between the haves and the have-nots, coordinating of flows in terms of time, in terms of attention, in terms of resources from the haves to the have-nots. I could go on and on for hours, but in order for this to happen, we'll probably need to select bits and pieces from all the levels. I mean, there's a level preceding the opaque mind as well, basically the tribal mind, and many of those are not yet equipped to even sort of be able to participate in these digital media because they simply haven't got a smartphone or a laptop or broadband internet or whatnot. So there's suddenly 5 levels, right? So tribal mind, opaque mind, absorbent mind, transceiving mind, and possibly a collaborative mind, performing mind, you could also call the 5th level. The quickest way to begin to figure these things out is probably to participate and explore what happens if you move slightly beyond old metaphors. So media here is kind of possibly a misnomer. I mean, it's helpful in a way because we sort of plunk these things out and we seem to sort of communicate. But what if we can actually converse? What if we can sculpt time? What if we can enact time flows? What if we can hold space? In order to do that, we first need to figure out what are the digital time flows. What are our preferred combinations of time and space, synchronous, asynchronous, what parts of ourselves can we extend, who else can we get to attract to our story, can we share select parts of our story, and to what end. So there's so many questions here that we have sort of just barely sort of begun to scratch the surface on. But one of the most promising is probably the act of participation itself. Basically sort of throwing ourselves out there. I mean, basically what I just did now with this Hangout. If we go with the metaphor of a medium, and if we posit that there might be social cognition possible, then we probably will need eventually to build slightly different platforms to on top of which we can sort of enact these media. We need slightly new metaphors. I mean, we need to figure out what parts of the old metaphors can we use, what parts of the old metaphors do we need to let go of. I mean, male, Western, hierarchical, whatnot. Are some of them even useful anymore, or do we need to design new ones? What seems to still hold water, and sort of pardon the metaphor, is storytelling. Although I would like to sort of posit that possibly once we've sort of gone through and we're beginning to sort of grow sort of a critical mass of people doing social cognition, however we would define that, possibly we will be able to not only do storytelling but story weaving, as if there's not only a tug of war between individual sense making and collective sense making. Storytelling could possibly be sort of augmented, accelerated, advanced, adapted, so it would sort of find whatever tropes, metaphors, turns of phrase, pithy quotes and pretty pictures, if that's kind of what we want to sort of package it as, to further what we choose to use storytelling for. Me and a couple of others, we sort of begun to explore this in something we call knowledge expeditions, basically using the metaphor of climbing a mountain, and then the lower levels, if that expression is allowed, basically tribal mind or Opaque mind, those are the villages, and then we are sort of exploring transceiving mind and collectively collaborative mind, social cognition mind. We are the climbers, right? So we are sort of climbing beyond the usual traditional ways of using these media. Now, in order to climb up and sort of discover new things in terms of enactivity, intersubjectivity, immersion, participatory sense making, and God knows else what we are kind of discovering right now, it also sort of behooves us to find ways to bring select parts of this back to the village. This is a formidable challenge because the village operates on mostly collectively defined package deal narratives, basically war, greed, fear, mistrust, everyone for themselves, curiously mixed with a subservience to whatever dominant power narratives is at play in what particular village, in what particular culture. But if we manage to get back to the village with some select findings, I believe that when that happens, we will notice by an increased digital literacy. But actually, digital literacy is a bit of a misnomer. I sort of prefer to call it a 21st century literacies, because these literacies needs also to be brought back and reconnected with our analog selves. So from a strict information and signal processing perspective, this is very simple. All of us who now, let's say all the 360 million active accounts, instead of active accounts, we could basically say this is 360 million human beings, right? As embodied and as analog as they come, as we are. And then there's the digital signal processing going on. So I'm kind of sending out this Hangout, and it gets plussed or shared or commented or timestamped or further built on or not. Right? So it's kind of fares throughout. And at the receiving end, or as I would like to say, the kind of the intersubjectivity and activity end, because it's kind of us all the time, there's someone interpreting this digital send and either thinks it's sort of a complete waste of time or finds something in it that is of sort of insight and internalize select parts, and then this from digital back to analog. A good thing seems to be again here, storytelling seems to work. So when there's a group of people in an Hangout, we seem to be able already to bridge, to pretend as there's people around my real physical table where I'm sitting right now. And when that is imagined collectively in the group, the signal improves. The signal is still digital. I mean, this is kind of still a digital artifact, which I'm kind of recording right now. Why bother with digital platforms then? Couldn't we just sort of gather together in our physical real places? Well, it would be kind of a bit of an inconvenience for me to sort of welcome 360 million people at my kitchen or around my laptop. But there's also the enactivity affordance of the digital medium itself once we are figuring out how to use these tools is offering us a chance to take a couple of next steps. There's 4 quadrants here. Let's see if we can touch upon. These 360 million people are already performing, although via digital algorithm proxy, and most of that data is kind of squirreled away by proprietary platform owners, in this case Google. We still get sort of some select parts of the data which we can sort of glean, graph traversal, figuring out what graph is which, what to do, how to reach reciprocity, resonance, reach, and whatnot, based on data, however we define and use that. So very briefly and kind of simplified enormously, there is collective intelligence already, although via algorithm and via heuristics, whichever ones we use. Building on that, there's intelligence. I mean that in 2 senses, both in terms of intelligence, kind of gossip from other people, as if this would be kind of a massively multiplayer knowledge ecosystem game, but also in the terms of a human collective internalizing of all this signaling, sense making, if you will, out of which can sort of spawn new narratives. I mean, we don't know yet because we haven't sort of gotten that far yet. So that is collective intelligence and intelligence. Then, if we sort of move further towards how we as individuals make sense of this, this is sort of a crucial part. I mean, this quadrant is possibly the pivotal one, which is called attention. Attention is something we haven't really solved yet in the digital environment because there's too many of us. There's, I mean, there's 360 million people in Google Plus alone, active accounts. Let's say there's 4 million people who I would love to meet. I can't possibly meet them all. There's 30,000 people in my circles. I can't possibly interact with them all. There's 1,100 people in the conversation community, which I'm sort of have founded. I still can't possibly interact with them all, even though they are sort of in my community, and I should give them attention because they sort of joined. But let's say I can sort of reach 3% of those 1,100, which would be kind of approximately a bit more than 30 people. There would still be 30 people who I would never otherwise have met. So if I give attention to them and they reciprocate in kind, giving attention back to me, there's all kinds of nice things we can do if we see attention as basically the new currency in the 21st century. There's a fourth quadrant as well, which is a bit simplified, we could call will. And now, instead of just doing quadrants, this will then sort of feeds back. I mean, if we sort of grow skillful will, and we, out of our attention, we grow increasingly skill in what we give our attention to, and how that trim tabs or not, sort of the collective intelligence out there, the network, if you will, the graph. So basically, will operationalized becomes graph traversal, how we send stuff out. I mean, content, right? So once we have sort of moved beyond just content marketing in terms of, we could say, content traversal, content coordination, we sort of closed the circle, and we can sort of spiral up in terms of this evolution of ourselves via these digital realms. Which leads us to the fall back to where we started, that in order to perform these operations, these network operations, this sort of scaling up, this zooming in, zooming out, in between I and we, in between internal and external, we need to better understand our own minds. Not only kind of the minds we've got, but also how our minds are now beginning to change and adapt, because there's a digital realm which we are enacting. So again, these digital literacies that we can sort of begin to own and use, we won't be able to use them, basically, if we are not prepared to transform a bit our opaque mind. So it's kind of not full-blown denial. So we're not just playing it safe by just doing cats and dogs or pithy quotes and pretty pictures. We can't absorb it all. We can't just go fully absorbed mind on our platform, because it will overwhelm us. I mean, there's tons of people I know already who are sort of sick and tired of all of the content, even the good content. Transceiving mind remains heavily ritualized by content marketing, basically hijacking of storytelling for commercial purposes. That will change. That's kind of the easy part of the equation. I mean, most content marketers are basically good people, well, opportunists, and want to make a buck. There's nothing wrong with that. So the two primary challenges are our old notions of I and we, individual and collective. That boundary, which is obviously always a bit sort of fragile and sensitive for most people, needs to be renegotiated, rediscovered. And then how we define internal and external, basically how we define as if there's a digital part of ourselves that can part of possibly even become more of a semi-autonomous avatar, which it actually already does. It just that we don't usually think about it that way. I mean, the part of my digital brand that is actually resonant with who I am, in a way. Now, in terms of shared understanding, given these two challenges, there's very, very little shared understanding still. I mean, there's language barriers in terms of the I and the collective and individual, the language barriers between external and internal, in terms of extrovert and introvert, just to mention one thing. Levels of confidence, levels of influence, our data being squirreled away by the proprietary platform owners. But nevertheless, despite almost all this, we are sort of slowly but surely beginning to grasp who we are, even whilst on these platforms. So even though you could sort of sort of half-jokingly say, how do people understand each other? Well, in the digital realm, badly. Right? It's still not zero. So this is kind of possible. I can sort of leave this sort of end this hangout with a sign of hope. And given that, at least in Google+, there's an enormously hopeful sign to boot, in addition to Facebook. A large proportion of the content marketers are eminently helpful. I mean, they're helpful to back their own ends, right? To make a buck, but nevertheless, they are really helpful. And that's basically all it takes. If we help each other think things through, we will slowly, yet little by little, understand each other better. And once there's sort of some kind of beginning shared understanding here and there, I mean, my guess is it will start with small groups of people to begin with, 4 or 5 people, 15 people. It will almost look like tribes, but they will not be tribes, right? The key difference here is that what gels in between these small groups will be social cognition, which is a completely different thing than the small groups forming around the tribal mind. So again, to simplify enormously, the tribal mind is built on shame, right? So you adhere to the small groups, tribal mind dynamics, because otherwise they will shame you, right? And you will sort of be felt sort of excluded and left out, which is terrible. The new groups that are kind of slowly forming is an adherence to not a tribe and a particular place and particular gods, archetypes, and whatnot. It's much more fluid than that. It's a bit similar to a quest, but it's actually not a quest in the kind of old way. But since we're kind of grasping after sort of what metaphors and archetypes patterns works, let's call it a quest now, right? My guess would be that actually the graph traversal itself is a way of figuring out. And it's actually really simple, as I kind of alluded in the digital signal processing example. And it could possibly be even simpler, that we are rediscovering ourselves and others. So then these digital realms aren't just digital realms. I mean, that's kind of my thought, right? As if there's space-time flows equally real, although some of them are realized via digital channels. Kind of the very, very simple notion that it's still us here now. It's just sort of some of the, it's not carrier pigeon anymore, it's ones and zeros. Once we establish these groups, the way to scale this is probably using select parts of what's already built. I mean, cat gifs, that's for kind of anchoring back sort of to something tangible, something local, something readily identifiable. Social media itself, I mean, Snapchat, anything, right, which is kind of messaging purely, kind of mostly selfie, right? Selfie in group and selfie, and endless variations. And the social learning that is kind of basically powered by our sort of trying to figure out who we are via selfies. And also on top of that, the social cognition, once it's kind of slightly more freed from the ritualization of content marketing and marketing. You could say, with a bit of a license, creative license, that transmedia and transmedia literacy is kind of our first sort of stumbling attempts on figuring out a possible synthesis. Yet, I mean, transmedia is kind of still very much sort of dependent on media and also kind of a kind of a possible movement beyond, right? And then my positing is that we don't need to move beyond, right? It's kind of fine-tuned things we've already got, right? I think that more or less covers what I wanted to sort of cram into this first send. See if I can have forgotten something. I will put this up in the conversation community and possibly see if I can find at least 1 or 2 timestamps. So for those who are sort of completely out of time, whatever that is, will then sort of be able to sort of capture something if they have sort of 2 minutes to spare or something. I think still it makes sense to have these slightly longer hangouts, because I mean, ask me again in 3 months and I would go find different timestamps out of this very same video, because things will have changed. Next send would probably deal with playfulness and how that relates to enaction, sense making, and enactivity. There's possibly a third send eventually also, where I probably would sort of delve into immersion, right, as a possible word to use to bridge in between real analog embodied self and digital self. Those are in the future, and mad waves, and talk to you soon. Okay, bye for now.